Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session of UCalgary's webinar series. I'm Deborah Yedlin, and I'm your moderator for today. If you've participated in one of our previous webinars, welcome back. And to all our new viewers, thank you for joining us. The energy sector has been an engine of prosperity for Alberta and for Canada. Energy accounts for Canada's largest export, and it is an important economic driver for this country from coast to coast to coast. Trends over the last few years, however, have shown us that the energy sector that we know has to evolve. International pressure to lower carbon emissions, demand for more sustainable energy, and harsh economic realities are all driving the need for Canada's energy transition. In the last 2 days, we have seen the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund blacklist Canadian Natural Resources, Suncor Energy, Cenovus, and Imperial Oil for unacceptable greenhouse gas emissions. And today, the World Economic Forum said Canada wasn't doing enough to move towards sustainable energy. It feels like the energy sector in Canada is under constant attack. We're joined today by Peter Tertzakian, who will share his expertise in this field. He'll start us off with a presentation and then answer the questions from the audience. If you have a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. The webinar will also be available on demand, and we'll send you a link once it's online. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're recording this webinar on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Peter Tertzakian is an economist, investment strategist, and best-selling author. He's an adjunct professor at UCalgary's Haskayne School of Business and the executive director of the ARC Energy Research Institute. Peter is a respected public speaker, much sought after, in fact, podcaster, blogger, and author, and advisor to governments. He's devoted his career to energy, first as a geophysicist, then written 2 bestsellers, 1,000 Barrels a Second, and The End of Energy Obesity. And he's just launched his new project, Energy File, and a new book, The Investor Visit. Welcome, Peter. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Deborah, and thanks to the University of Calgary for hosting me. What I'd like to do is give a very high-level view of the notion of energy transition, which is the subject of our discussion, and then Deborah, you and I can have a conversation about what it all means to Canada and get into some of those contentious issues and questions that we all have to think about as we transition through now the pandemic and think about a post-pandemic world. So what I'm going to do here is share my screen. I've got a bit of an introductory monologue, and then after about 5 to 10 minutes, then we can carry on the conversation. So let me just quickly share my screen and get a photo up and running here. Okay, well, I think when we think about energy transition, this is one of the photographs in my collection that I took. One can think of sort of these wind turbines looming over the hill to the back, lurking and taking over the fossil fuel, oil and gas industry and whatever. You know, we have to think about transition in much broader terms. And I always like to go back to my collection of museum artifacts and things that are in my Energy File collection that Deborah mentioned. So if you'd like to see that collection, it's at energyfile.org. File is P-H-I-L-E, as in aficionado. And in my collection, I've got this postcard over here, which is a postcard of the RMS Victorian. And I'm going to put that on the screen right now. And if you go to the site, you'll see a picture of this ship with sort of billowing emissions from a coal-fired boiler as it goes forward. And so let me just blow that up for you, just to give you a sense of that postcard. This postcard is from 1905. And it's interesting to look at it. It was obviously commissioned by the Allen Line, which was the shipping company. But what's more interesting is actually, if you're like me, you sort of look at the very detailed nuances of old imagery, photographs, paintings, and what have you. And the interesting thing is we are transitioning to coal in this image. And it's from wind power. And if you look in the back, I've got it flashing there, you've got an old clipper ship that's sail powered. And indeed, this photo is doing much more than just showcasing the RMS Victorian. It's actually celebrating the rise of coal and transitioning away from wind power, which was really something that started occurring at least 100 years prior to this postcard in the Industrial Revolution. But the postcard basically says wind is dead, coal is in, and we're entering a new era in the world of shipping. The thing is that it took over 100 years to make that transition, to transition from sail power to coal power, and that's a whole separate story in itself. But this imagery, this sort of understanding of historic transitions combined with some other artifacts that I'm going to show you in a minute is really fundamental to understanding Canada's energy transition as we go forward. But let me just show you sort of a broad-based imagery of where we were immediately pre-pandemic and talk about our transition expectations, whether it's globally or whether it's indeed here just in Canada. The timeline on the bottom has the 2020s, and the far end, I'll just put the 2050 as the target that many people were talking about pre-pandemic as terms of net zero, not only in terms of emissions from oil and gas, but emissions just broadly from every sector of the economy. And so the tile mosaic of photographs there of emissions, traffic jams, airplanes. I've even thrown in now a little bit of a Zoom diagram there in terms of how people are communicating now. So that notion was that we were going to transition to some utopian version of the future where we have the cities of the future, robotics, completely even new energy systems such as fusion power that are completely clean, or electrification, flying vehicles that are powered by electricity, and so on and so forth. And that transition was a 30-year, fairly aggressive transition to the future that would see us in a much healthier, environmentally sustainable form, and dominantly driven by the climate change and reduction of emissions, the decarbonization view. Okay, well, let me just actually dive down here for a minute and take a look at Canada's energy consumption. This is consumption, not supply. This is consumption by fuel between 1970 and a notional 2100. So this is like to the end of the century. So what we've got here is layers of, okay, this is coal and how it has trended over time in terms of how we've consumed our primary fuels. Oil is next, natural gas, a sliver of nuclear power that started in the 1970s as it did in most other countries. Hydroelectric power, which is a huge wedge in our power grid, and the emergence of the renewables, which would be wind, solar, and biomass. Actually, it's quite substantially biomass, and wind and solar is probably about 50% of that sliver there. Okay, so we can see the top line of our energy consumption steadily trending up, and the composition of all the primary sources of fuels that we use in this country. If we think about a complete decarbonization scenario or defossil fuelization scenario toward the end of 2100, this is the challenge that is at hand. If we assume that our hydro stays the same or potentially even grows, ditto for nuclear, and that the gas, oil, and coal tail off to zero by 2100, and the rest is driven by renewables and some other combination of, we'll call it zero carbon technologies. That's what it looks like. I'm just showing you what the task at hand is, and in terms of the challenge that's at play. Note that actually the trajectory of the growth curve has also necessarily had to flatten out, because energy efficiency and conservation and others have to be part of the solution going forward. I show this because even by 2050, the wedge that has to be fulfilled by, we'll call it green sources of energy, is very large. And the fact is that only very little amount of it has been put onto the top of the stack over the course of the last 20 years. This diagram, by the way, is actually very similar to the global type of picture in the world. In fact, the global picture has to be even more aggressive because much of the world's countries do not have that much hydropower as we do have. And so the challenge, even pre-pandemic, was daunting. We know we were on a path led by not only our own Canadian government, but many governments to try and get to that net zero by 2050, to try and reduce at least the emissions, not only on the supply side, but the consumption side. But even so, the drop off over the course of 30 years is a very dramatic one and very difficult one in terms of what it would take to do. If we now layer on top of this sort of the rate of change diagram, and if we think about 2020 to 2050, we can think of the rate of expected green energy transition to look something like this. Actually, it looks sort of like a pandemic curve, doesn't it? The peak rate of transition was expected to be in the 2030s, where you can think of the substitution of new technologies, say electric vehicles over combustion engines and things like that, was supposed to be really accelerating in the late 2020s, probably peaking in the late 2030s and then rolling down into the 2050s into some sort of largely decarbonized trend. You know, this is a very idealized type of diagram, just to give you a sense. And what I'm really trying to show you is that actually what I'm really trying to do is question whether this rate of expected green energy transition still holds, given now that we have this pandemic that has emerged. So the number one question actually that's on the minds of many who are studying the world of energy transitions, decarbonization, and new energy systems is, are the pre-pandemic expectations still valid? Is that path that we were seemingly on, which was exceedingly ambitious to begin with, is it still valid? And now we have a pandemic. Now, the pandemic has been very, very sudden, and we know it's changed the way that we live, work, and play, and that now we can think of a very aggressive rate of change in some of the things that we're doing. For example, how we communicate with each other, as evidenced with the Zoom call. But my question, and the question of others, is, well, maybe we're on some different transitional path once we come out of this, given all the changes that we're seeing. Say, we know that there's changes in things like business travel that's probably going to happen, potentially commuting, working from home. But on the flip side, I can also say that if you actually look at the most recent data, people are shunning public transit. So maybe that different path is not a path forward, but is actually a regressive path where people would prefer to stay in a car and get in a traffic jam rather than get on a public transit. We shall see. These are questions, as evidenced by the question marks on the screen, for which I don't think anybody has an answer. Certainly I don't claim to. But I think that the notion that we are on the same path as we were before is probably something we can agree is got to be reconsidered. When we think about transition, when we think about the current situation that we're in with this pandemic, I'll call it mid-pandemic, that there was a situation before, and there's going to be a situation after. And then we're going to talk about a relatively short time frame, not 30 years, not 70 years, but let's maybe even think about 3 to 5 years. And we think about situations in society that change our circumstance. So instead of throwing up the images that I threw before, you sort of imagine what our current situation is today, and that there is some event that leads us to a rapid transition in a relatively short time period to some situation and circumstance B. Again, simplistically, one can think that very aggressive commuting and business travel, other kinds of travel in situation A, and as a consequence of some event like the pandemic, we are transformed very quickly into situation B. Well, let's think about disruptive events, because if we think about pandemics, they are only one of many type of disruptions that can alter the course of transitioning anything in society. War, for example, has always been a strong catalyst for before and after change. Financial crisis only 10 years ago, and many before that over the course of history, has changed our circumstance. Environmental disasters at, say, the national level or the regional level. Natural disasters for countries that have sudden imposition of financial sanctions. That's a disruptive event and changes their circumstance in terms of the way they live, work, and play. Those three words are important, live, work, and play, because if you change the way we live, work, and play, and actually even the way we govern, in terms of the policies that we impose on the way we live, work, and play, necessarily that gives us a change to our energy consumption. We've seen that very dramatically, and we can talk about that some more. And that necessarily translates into potential changes into our energy sources, the conversion devices that we use, such as engines, furnaces, and so on. And then that in turn sort of feeds off of each other. These things are all intertwined, but the point I'm trying to make is that changes ensue anytime there is a very serious disruptive event. Say, take, for example, World War I and II. These were major catastrophic events in civil society. Before World War I, we were dominantly on steam engines and coal. In the interperiod between World War I and II, there was still significant remnants of steam engines and coal, but actually the world wars, because petroleum and combustion engines were strategic military advantage in things like tanks and naval ships and so on, it substantially accelerated the transition to combustion engines and petroleum. So there you have sort of relatively short time frames and facilitation of an energy transition by virtue of circumstance. And I would say to you that the transition drivers there were military power that really changed the way, of course, we were governed, a lot more money being poured into these things, and that accelerated the shift to petroleum. Let me show you another thing in my energy file collection. I've got this old magazine here, Standard Oil, which is the precursor, in this case, Standard Oil of California, to Chevron Corporation, one of the largest multinational oil companies in the world. And so in this magazine, which was just on the cusp of the World War I, talking about the changeover in naval ships from coal to petroleum. And the writer of the article basically says, coal is not even mentioned. Those dictionary makers have already counted out coal as a fuel. Of course, Standard Oil is in the oil business and has a substantial amount of stake into seeing that their business grows and displaces coal, which it did in the mobility business. In fact, I went out and looked for that dictionary which they were talking about, and that was the Funk and Wagnall's dictionary here of 1914. And looking under the definition of fuel, combustible matter used to kindle or sustain fire, produce heat as oil and wood, etc. Indeed, the definition no longer includes the word coal, which had become synonymous with energy, which had become synonymous with the word fuel. There was a sort of arrogance to this magazine that I point out in a story that goes on, that I've written that goes with this. And that is the arrogance, is that you're counting out the fuel very quickly. I think we know and we agree that coal today is certainly far from dead. It is not counted out and still lingers with us in our energy system and is the second biggest source of energy in the world after oil. And so the notion, again, as I come back to the postcard, which was only written, which was only published 10 years prior to this magazine, is that don't count out an energy system because they are very, very difficult to displace. Okay, but we do have other examples where things have changed. The 1973 oil embargo, for example, where we had supply shocks because the Middle Eastern countries and North African countries banded together and basically said to the Western countries, we're going to shut off access to our oil. That created all sorts of shortages. And indeed, really exposed to us now, by this time, by 73, how addicted we were to the combustion engines and petroleum as really the sole way of giving us mobility. And that realization led us to think differently about oil. And in fact, most of you have probably forgotten, but in the 1970s, there was a huge get off foreign oil, get off oil movement. And that led to the subsidization and stimulus dollars in terms of pushing oil out of the power generation market and the rise of nuclear power. Back then, nuclear power was the alternative energy of the day. In fact, like the renewable energy of the today, if you think about the metaphor to today. And that was seen as a large-scale substitute to push oil out, which it did successfully in the power generating market. And so the transition driver that emerged out of that relatively short time frame, that occurred very quickly, was a realization that, okay, we got to alter the course of the way we are thinking about our energy systems, also the way we consume, because that was also the era where small vehicles came into vogue. and also energy efficiency and energy fuel economy. So energy security actually became the dominant driver to transition from one state to another. I'll give you one more example, which is more current, and that is the financial crisis of 2008-9, lingered into 2010, certainly in 11 in Europe. And that was, as the name implies, a financial crisis. Put a lot of people out of work. And then the impetus was, well, how can we put people back to work? And 2007 being the backdrop with the climate change conference, the UNPCC conference, and when really the climate change agenda and was really accelerated, said, well, we need to subsidize the development and the encouragement of renewables, recognizing again the fossil fuel domination now because of an environmental impetus. And so the transition driver was stimulus dollars, and there was several $100 billion between the United States, China, Europe, and other places that were poured in to the renewable space only 10 years ago. And it was very effective. By 2015, the cost of technologies like solar and wind had really come down hard. The experience curve or the learning curve allowed us to bring in more of the renewables. In Canada, we saw that wedge start to emerge, as we've seen in many other countries. And so that breakthrough in modern renewables has made it cost competitive with the fossil fuels as we see it today in the power generation market. All right, well, I've given you 3 examples, and I've given you the notion that whenever you have a large-scale disruptive event, be it pandemic, be it war, be it some other crisis, unfortunately, history has no shortage of them, and we're not likely to see any fewer going forward, but they do have a tendency to change, as I said, that live, work, play circumstance, which leads to changing the governing circumstance and the policies that ensues. It tends to reprioritize and shuffle societal priorities from, from one paradigm to say energy security being a driver to military issues being a driver and so on. So maybe I'll leave it and here, Deborah, and we can just sort of talk about it as the question is, well, what are the drivers going to be going forward? And what is the new situation that we can expect? Are we still going to be able to spend a lot of dollars on the renewable wedge to take forward? Is that where the money should go? What are the priorities of society going to be? So I'm not actually biasing the answers here. I'm just here to talk about them because I think we're going to see new drivers emerge as a consequence of this pandemic. And I'll just throw out 2 to sort of stimulate the conversation. And one is the deglobalization and the one of increasing supply chain control within countries. We already know that in terms of medical equipment. And my question that I'm thinking about is, well, does that also apply to our energy systems? Right? How secure are we really? So there's that issue that I think is really big. And there is others, for example, we know that pandemics and the other types of disasters that I mentioned to you typically are destroyers of wealth over the course of the near term. In other words, there's not a lot of extra money to be spent either at the individual level, the corporate level, or beyond. And so therefore, what happens to the prioritization of how people feel where they should spend their money on? So I'm going to leave it at that. And as an introductory monologue, turn it over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to actually take us back to a line on your postcard and from the dictionary that talked about, coal still being here as a source of energy. And that was, we know that years ago, still a source of energy. Let's draw a parallel between the fact that oil is very cheap today and the cheap coal. And what does this mean for the transition? All of a sudden, the molecules are cheaper. Does it make it harder to transition to renewable options when we know we need every energy molecule to help us reignite economic growth? What is that? Where does that leave the whole transition conversation when you have a global economy that's basically skidded to a halt?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. The way I think about it is we know that the price of oil has collapsed down to $20 a barrel. It was in 50, so it's fallen by more than 2/3. I don't expect it to stay there, but it could stay there for 18 months, certainly below. There's a lot of oil in storage, but if you go to the gas pump, the last time I looked, regular gasoline was 59, 60 cents a liter, and pre-pandemic it was $1, $1.10.
Yeah.
This is like a massive carbon incentive.
Right.
I mean, this is an anti-carbon tax that has been induced into society. So some would call that a stimulus because it gives people more money into their pockets. But certainly, lowering the cost of anything in any industry is a barrier to entry for things that seek to displace it.
Right.
And so if you're asking me, is it going to be harder for somebody to make the leap to buy an electric car versus a gasoline car? I think the answer is yes. Because you say, well, why would I bother with the sort of mental paradigm that I'm in, that electric cars don't have range anxiety and blah, blah, blah. I'll just stick to what I know. And by the way, it's cheap.
So, from that perspective, we've looked at what's happened in the last couple of days, and how does this sort of square with the ESG and the climate change agenda that continues to manifest and be very outspoken, especially when it comes to Canadian energy? We're back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. People want to have food, shelter, jobs, and other things, and they want it to be affordable. So how do you sort of insert that transition agenda that could cause costs to go up at a time when that's a very difficult thing to
yeah. So, there's a number of different perspectives you can come at that question. Or you can come at it from the perspective of what's happening to the oil and gas industry and how much economic benefit that generates, and how the event is creating widespread unemployment and also a collapse of revenue dollars and taxation of the largest resource industry in the country. Or you can come at it from the perspective of what does it do to the notion of wanting to decarbonize our energy systems, which, as I said, costs a lot of money. We really haven't made a huge dent in that over the course of the last 10 years, nor has any other country, frankly, globally, after spending a lot of money on it.
So, question for you from that has been submitted. If Alberta takes all the steps that we can to transition our oil and gas sector to a low carbon economy, can we actually transition at equal value in terms of the number of jobs and growth?
So if the question is, can we switch from oil and gas to, say, wind and solar and other types of things, if that's the question, then the answer is no.
Yeah.
No, because the export of oil and gas to the United States in 2019, 18, I think, is 18 or 19. Anyway, it was roughly the same in both years. It's about $120 billion.
Yeah.
This is not money that, that's money coming into our country from the sale of these products. So if you think about renewables produce electricity.
Yeah.
And so the sale of electricity from Canada to the United States, from Hydro-Quebec and BC Hydro and places like that, the sum total of that in the last couple of years is about $2 billion. So the scale is not well understood in terms of the economic value of what it is that we produce here.
What about some of those sort of low carbon options, such as bitumen beyond combustion, or we're looking at geothermal, hydrogen, blue hydrogen? Yeah. How does that change things if we sort of try and get a sort of a holistic mix, so to speak, of different sources of energy? Does that look differently for Alberta? So we still have the energy underlying in terms of the traditional exports, but also the other pieces that are renewable and low carbon. Does that sort of?
Yeah. I think if you're asking me, can we diversify off of our petroleum base and pivot to cleaner uses of the fuel to create longer term employment, assuming there's sort of a holistic plan to do that, and put our drillers to work drilling geothermal wells and things, and a whole variety of things. I mean, I think the answer, can we diversify our economy sufficiently to put the 4 million people minus young people, infants and retired people to work? The answer is probably yes. But if you're asking me if we can replace $120 billion of exports, which ultimately feed back into things like the Canadian dollar, trade deficits, and all those sorts of things, and taxation, which is I think is about 20 billion a year to the country. Not overnight, absolutely not. And I think this is the tension that we have, is that this commodity that we produce is a major export commodity. It's not that the vast majority of what we produce is sold as export.
So it's interesting because there's often a conversation that starts with, we need a strong energy sector to sort of transition to the development of alternative energy technologies and lower carbon sources.
Mm-hmm.
Is that inconsistent? Like, how do people will sort of see that as an inconsistent position? Why do we need a strong energy sector if we want to transition to a cleaner barrel, so to speak, or a cleaner, a different energy system?
Okay, because we are confusing what we use and where we get what we use with what we export.
Right.
And I think that this is, we really need to clarify this, because it's not well understood that, I'm going to try and find a slide for you that I want to share that really speaks to our sort of circumstance. Because when people say we need stimulus dollars today, let's use this pandemic to bring about more renewables in Canada. So the realization is not there that actually most of our power grid is already decarbonized.
Right.
More than, I would say, probably 90% of the countries in the world. And so, I can actually show you here just really quickly if I share my screen, and I will do that like this. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Electricity generation by fuel in Canada, 2005 to 18. So we consume about 600 million megawatt hours. So there's the renewables, hydro, nuclear. So this whole part of the stack here is effectively zero carbon.
We get no credit for it.
Yeah, we don't get credit for it. So fossil fuels is here. And I'm going to show you another slide, because this is so important to understand the polarization in this country. Emanates actually from this. And that is, let me show you, I think this, well, let's look at this slide. Electricity generation by fuel in Canada. So hydro is so big, okay? Renewables, this would be wind, solar, and biomass are over here, nuclear. So, this is all decarbonized. So gas, coal is being taken out of the system, which is good. So actually there's oil plus natural gas. There isn't that much to push out. But here's the kicker, okay, is that you say, well, where is that geographically? Where is it all geographically? Okay, so I'm going to give it to you. Well, let's start, I think it's right here. Okay, there's Quebec. Almost 100% hydro. Well, of course, it's easy for them to say everybody else has to decarbonize because they're already decarbonized, right? Basically 100% decarbonized. Here's Alberta. So our coal is starting to go down. We use a lot of natural gas, dominantly the oil sands. So coal and gas, I mean, nobody really in the country uses a lot of oil. The Maritimes still use a bit, and northern communities that use diesel for their generators, and remote communities still do. But now you can see the contrast, right? You can see the contrast between the provinces. I'm going to take you to, let's go to, oh, here's Ontario. Okay, nuclear and hydro, they've successfully decarbonized over the course of the last 10 years. They paid for it, right? Their gas is going down and their renewables has been going up. Okay, so Ontario and Quebec, the two largest population centers, and also where the power base politically is in this country, is completely decarbonized. And so I'll just show you the rest of the country here. Saskatchewan,
Yeah.
Okay, Saskatchewan is coal and gas. Well, of course, that's what's underneath their feet. That's how they grew up. They've got a little bit of hydro and a bit of renewables. But it gets back to your question, Deborah, about when the fuels are cheap. Well, there's not a lot of incentive economically to switch, right? And so, but I'm just going to show you. I think, what do we have here? Okay, here's the Maritimes, and I've highlighted the thing. It's really not that much. 14 is the maximum on the scale. Whereas if you go back to, for example, British Columbia, which is also completely decarbonized, is 80. So, interestingly, the Maritimes has a mix of a lot of different things. The renewables are definitely on the rise. But here's really the point that I'm trying to make. And that is that, this call for stimulus dollars to spend on renewables, really, there's only 2 provinces of significance where you can still push it out, and that's Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
But it's not like you're going to build wind turbines in Quebec or BC because they don't need it. Yeah. They're already decarbonized. And so the money that, if we earmark to transition, really needs to be earmarked, in my opinion, to the consumption side.
Yeah.
That's where the bulk of the emissions are generated. And in consumption now, we've got actually big gains that could be made for actually far fewer dollars. For example, in energy efficiency, insulation, and education about conservation, all sorts of things. So, that's, I hope I've given you sort of a flavor for the challenge, and I hopefully highlight 2 important points. First, oil and gas is dominantly an export. And number 2, and generates a lot of economic value for the country. And number 2, that actually the call to build more renewables is only applicable in 2 places, Alberta and Saskatchewan, both of which have extremely cheap and abundant quantities of existing fuels. So it's very difficult to justify.
So question, considering that alternative energy technologies require fossil fuels at every stage of development, would the lower cost of manufacturing be an incentive for faster transition? I guess, yeah, I mean, that seems to speak again to this notion of, cheaper fuels means a lower cost of manufacturing. And again, that goes back to the end user consumption piece. How do we sort of address the consumption side of the equation? And especially at a time where there's disincentive, because the whole supply chain is energy fueled. So let's talk about that.
Well, I think the consumption side, the pandemic has shown us very clearly how to cut consumption.
Right.
I mean, it's shown us we can slash 30% of our oil consumption over literally in the span of 10 days. But everybody has to stay home and you can't go on vacation. So it's difficult to do.
Right.
So now you start thinking, well, all right, we're probably, I mean, the data, by the way, on recovering gasoline demand, as I said, in China and now in some of the European cities, is pretty clear that congestion is coming back in a big way because nobody wants to use public transport. So it's not like we're getting off of oil anytime soon. So we got to start thinking about, okay, fuel economy and how to improve fuel economy, how to get people thinking about different ways of transport. Post-financial crisis, actually no, post the era of 2005 to 7-ish, where we had very high oil prices, right? And very high gasoline prices as a consequence, a lot of geopolitical stuff. People were van pooling, carpooling. At that time, even there was a bit of telework, they called it at the time. Companies said, we understand that gasoline's expensive, stay at home if you want on Fridays. Those were the kind of policies. Well, today, with the pandemic, if everybody doesn't want to be around everybody, like van pooling, carpooling doesn't work. Anyway, I want to, getting back to your question though, is
I think what the question too, Piers, is that it's the downstream emissions. It's that it's what we use that are responsible for 80% of
Yeah.
emissions. And so how do we deal with that piece? Because it's always, the onus seems to continuously be on the energy sector to reduce emissions, but there's never the quid pro quo on the other side to say, okay, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I don't understand why, you know, Norway has been sanctioning oil and gas upstream so much and not saying a word on the companies that make internal combustion engines that are responsible for generating greenhouse gases. I mean, as I like to say, oil and gas don't emit anything. It's the devices and people who burn them that make the emissions. And as you point out, it's 80% of the emissions come from that consumption side. So, you know, I've written about it 10 years ago in my second book that you can cut your emissions dramatically if you just buy a smaller car.
Right.
You know, actually today I've looked at the emissions numbers recently from the biggest SUV to the smallest combustion engine vehicle. It's a 4-to-1 difference. Yeah. Per kilometer. Like you can slash your emissions per kilometer by 75%, well in excess of any Paris target, if you just get people to buy a smaller car. So, you know, I'm not going to patronize people and say, go out and buy a smaller car. I'm just saying that there's more than one ways to skin the cat than just beating up on the oil and gas industry.
So what you're saying basically is even if we got to a zero carbon barrel, it really wouldn't make a whole lot of difference.
No, and I'm also saying, I'll say it because it's not necessarily clear, that spending all, if you had 100 stimulus dollars, spending that 100 stimulus dollars upstream is very expensive, probably not going to buy that much, certainly in this country. And that $100 should be spent on the downstream and consumption side because you'll get much bigger bang for your buck if your transitional objective is to decarbonize. So
it's what we're living with today in terms of demand, which has been substantially curtailed as a result of the pandemic, has taken us to a level of consumption where there's some forecasts put us at for 2040, so to speak. And so, you know, one of the questions here is, if we were to turn off fossil fuels tomorrow, what would the energy gap be? We're kind of there because, you know, we're using less fuel to move because no one's moving. So what we're using today is being used for what exactly? And I guess that's the piece that maybe a lot of people don't understand, that it's transportation is one side of it, but energy and those hydrocarbon molecules are used for other things that we're continuing to use in a significant way because demand is still in that sort of 70 million barrels a day. So why don't we talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, sure. So 60% of a barrel of oil, 60, goes to transportation. And of that 60%, 2/3 goes to land, basically cars and personal mobility. The remaining third goes to big ships, airplanes, railroads, those sorts of things, diesel engines, trucks, which deliver our food and all that kind of stuff. And so those trucks are certainly still moving. The cruise ships are off, but other things are still moving. There's still air traffic, not as much as before, but air traffic is not that consequential, to be honest with you. It's that land mobility that is the big component. But let's talk about the other 40% of a barrel that has nothing to do with mobility. I mean, that goes to all the lubricants for motors, whether they're electric or otherwise, and everything else that makes a wheel turn. Then, of course, there's petrochemicals that goes into everything from medical equipment to, you know, my glasses to shoes. There's nothing really you can't do in modern society with that other 40%. And yeah, there's been a slowdown in the retail component of that, but in some instances, we're ramping up the manufacture of other things like medical equipment and so on. You know, there's trade-offs. There's no question that the whole demand for oil has dropped by about 30%. But a lot of the industrial processes are still going. a lot of the mobility that's necessary to deliver food on our table and all the other amenities and all the stuff that you're ordering online that's coming to your door is still going. So if you're not going out, I imagine a lot of people are getting packages to the door. I know we are. So that's got us come from somewhere. Yeah, so it's an essential commodity. So I mean, the statement that was made, a week, 10 days ago, I can't remember, oil is dead.
That was last week. That was Elizabeth.
Yeah, like, okay, oil, like, why are we making this blanket statement? Yeah. It's just ridiculous.
What would you like to say to Elizabeth May?
Well, I'd like to say to Elizabeth May that, you need to think about your words carefully. Because there's nothing that you can do in modern life, whether it's the clothes you wear or the goods that you get delivered or whatever, that can't be done without this exceedingly valuable product. I'm the first to say that we waste the stuff, especially in the mobility, and we got to deal with that. And we can do substantial reductions in emissions and so on just by taking care of that. But to say that it's dead is ridiculous. And also to sort of generalize and say Canadian oil is dead is a ridiculous statement, because we are the 5th largest producer of oil and gas in the world. There's a wide variety of producers out there that have different product mixes, different cost structures, different geographies, different capabilities. I mean, to broadly generalize is an unfounded statement.
So let's just sort of bring that home a little bit. So you say we're the 5th largest producer in the world. We've just come through a first quarter where there's been no end of bad news. What are the opportunities for Canadian oil and Canadian oil as the shale production declines in the States? What will it take for Canadian energy to be profitable? And how do you see the energy sector looking for, like, what opportunities presenting itself to increase profitability and increase market share, so to speak?
Yeah, well, it's a great question that I think we're all trying to grapple with. But, I'm pretty confident that once we come out of this, we're still going to be the 5th largest producer of oil and gas in the world. And 5 years from now, though, it's not going to look like the industry we had today. So we have to be vigilant, as we were even before the pandemic, to lower our costs to be competitive. And those companies that don't, and like in any industry that's very diverse, there's always the progressive companies that are proactive in doing that and the ones that don't. And it's just an evolution. Yeah, let me just sort of digress momentarily. Like, this isn't the first downturn this industry's seen. No, and I'm the first to admit, certainly this is the most dramatic, I think, in ever, certainly that I've seen. But if you look at the before and after, much as I showed on my before and after diagram, every time you go through this, the industry comes out of it sort of leaner, and it's just a survival of the fittest. It's very Darwinian. So we're going to see a leaner industry come out of this. What we now need to do is also concentrate on the cleaner. So leaner, cleaner. And we were on that path. It's been punctuated at the moment. We're going to get back on that path, because I know, in talking to people in the oil and gas community, that is not a forgotten virtue.
No, and certainly that's why we've heard companies continue to talk about the importance of decreasing emissions and decreasing intensity. But the energy sector in Canada was just starting to really find its stride again after the collapse in oil prices in 2014, 2015, and now is dealing with this collapse again. How much leaner and meaner can the energy sector get? Like, what's left? How do you pivot to being even more profitable? I mean, they've cut so many positions. They've looked at different ways to produce the energy. Where else do you go?
Well, all I can say is there's a lot of clever people in this province. And, I'll give you a little anecdote from, maybe 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, where the price of natural gas, I don't know, was $8, $8, right? And there was some of us and other analysts saying, well, it's going to go to 4, it's going to go to 3. And, it's like, what? Are you kidding? There's no way we could survive at $4 gas. There's no way we could survive at $3. Are you kidding me? Well, guess what? Today, natural gas companies, there's many of them that actually can do well at 2.
Yeah.
Right? And so what, I'm not saying it's easy. Like, I'm not trying to represent, but, by the way, give me an industry other than oil and gas where it's easy, right? Try being in retail, try being in newspaper publishing, try being in entertainment. Like, there's nowhere that's easy. And sometimes events like this just make you think more innovatively about how to be leaner. So I don't have the answer to that question, but I know that there's technologies out there, and I'm seeing companies that are saying, okay, we got to get leaner yet. It's not good enough. It's going to happen. Like, we're going to be around. It's not going to look different. It's going to look different from before.
Do you have a sense of what that different looks like? Or are you still
finding,
what does it look like? Let's say 12 months out, what do we look like? What does Canada's energy sector look like?
I think it's the consolidation side of it is inevitable.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unfortunate that, and we've seen this in other industries where small corner stores and things like that, the big box stores roll in, consolidate, and makes for leaner costs. That's a whole other subject, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. But the reality is that this industry is going to probably be fewer companies that are larger as we go forward. That'll be leaner. I think that from an employment standpoint, that's probably good, because if we're leaner, we're gonna need people, and probably a different set of people because of all the technology that's coming in. I won't deny that. Like, there's a lot of, but again, give me an industry in the world that isn't undergoing the same sorts of tensions, right? And when you have a disruptive event like this, all of a sudden it's a rally cry. Okay, how do we adapt to the new world? And a certain segment of the industry gets it and figures it out and does it, and those that don't are left behind. And then those that get it grow into the gap. We're going to see it in airlines. We're going to see it in all sorts of other industries as a consequence of this. Oil and gas here will be no exception.
So one of the things we talk about is sustainable energy development, and how Canada has such an advantage because we do have a highly educated population. We have this fantastic resource. Mm-hmm. Why can't we be the global champion for sustainable energy development and lead the world in clean tech, in in terms of value added products that come, so that we're not just a harvester as well of the product, but we're actually doing something with it? Why can't we sort of find that integrated piece? What's stopping Canada or Alberta from being that leader on the world stage?
Well, thank you for that question, because it's something that and I know you, Deborah, too, have, talked about the value add and the need to, we're so fortunate in this province, in this country. We have it all. Like, we have abundance in all the different energy sources. And that includes even wind and sun. I mean, look outside today feel the wind today. I mean, we've got abundance in all these things: agriculture, forestry, like, you name it. And we know how to get it and extract it at low cost. So the natural extension is to start thinking about how to add value to that in a lean, clean, and frankly mean and competitive way to compete with the rest of the world. And so the opportunities are here now, and I think we are waking up to that. But I want to get back to 2 words that were used in that question. How do we become champions and leaders of sustainable and clean energy? So my standard response to that question is, define for me clean. What is clean? Right? Are we talking about completely zero carbon? Okay. Well, what if we are able to extract net zero oil and gas? Is that clean? What is clean? What is sustainable? I think we need actually to step back and define those terms. And they're definable. And then we will be able to demonstrate and measure ourselves against others, but in terms of that terminology, and hopefully, convince, and I don't know why we have to convince the Norwegians, but you know, I think the rest of the world, because I mean, I don't view the Norwegians as being exceptionally clean, drilling offshore Arctic oil, frankly, and tankers going in and out. Is that clean? Like what's the definition here?
Yeah, we still see this continued push by BlackRock, State Street, and other investors to address this ESG notion. And so I guess, do you see Canadian businesses, Canadian energy companies, that having any sort of competitive advantage in terms of what we're doing versus what other countries and companies are doing around the world? Or are we just all into the same bucket?
No, absolutely I do. Because I can tell you that, again, pre-pandemic, I'd say only, less than a year, 9 months pre-pandemic, we were getting a completely different narrative and a different set of rally cries out of our oil and gas industry. Some of the biggest companies were talking about net zero and committing to it. And I went to meetings with them and saw what they were doing. And I was going, wow, this is amazing. And I know that I went and gave some presentations in the US and Europe late last year. And it was clear to me that we're way behind us. But how do we communicate that we are doing these things is still elusive to communicate effectively. Yeah. And, but I think we were on our way to be able to tell a really good story. And now we've got the pandemic. We can't forget that. Yeah. I do think we're going to get back on track, and we're going to have a leaner and cleaner story to tell.
We've seen the majors leaving Canada over the last several years, whether it's oil sands, whether it's Ovintiv now in Canada moving down to the US. Are you worried that we're going to see sort of the incredible shrinking energy sector in Canada, and there's going to be a concentration of assets in a smaller number of hands? Does that concern you at all?
On the surface, yes. I mean, that's psychologically damaging as well, I think, to a lot of people. But if we've been around the business as I have since, I'm not even going to tell you, but I tell you that this is the multinationals ebb and flow.
Right.
They seem to leave at exactly the wrong time, and they come in at exactly the wrong time. So they're sort of counter-cyclical in terms of the way they come and go. But no, I don't want to trivialize that, in a sense that we have lost a lot of multinational and foreign investment. I think we can get it back. But honestly, it's not necessarily good to have a lot of foreign ownership, in my opinion, because what was happening, it was that a lot of the cash flow that was generated was just being shipped out of the country.
Right.
I think we have a unique opportunity to make a made in Canada industry now, where the cash flows and the profits can be kept in this country, and they're substantial. I mean, I told you the revenues are 120 billion a year. And if we keep that money in the country and invest it wisely into this diversification, value added, all the other things that can make us sustainable, including beyond oil and gas, boy, do we have a huge opportunity. So, the foreign multinationals on the surface, yeah, it's not good. But if you really think about it, hey, let them go. We'll build our own industry, because we have something that most other countries in the world would clamor over in terms of our resource set.
So we have 30 seconds left. So I'm going to just wrap it up. And I want to say thank you very much for your insights. As always, you always leave us with more to think about and better informed than when we start our sessions with you, Peter, no matter where we have the opportunity to listen to you. So thank you very much. I just want to mention that everybody who signed up today will get an email with a link to view the session on demand. And please join us for our next webinar on May 21st as we share resources for coping with ADHD during this period of isolation. There'll be more information about this webinar, and additional content will be available at ucalgary.ca/covidsupport. If you'd like to support our research into COVID-19, you can visit ucalgary.ca/giving day, where you can choose to donate to Student Relief or our research fund. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. See you next time.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thanks, Peter.